that revenge world, some stories arrive already tightened into a single moment, like everything that happened before was just the slow walk toward one locked door. This one starts in a courthouse hallway where the air feels too clean, and nobody speaks above a whisper because the stakes are supposed to sound polite. Elena Crawford is the kind of woman families call difficult when what they really mean is unowned. What happened to her matters because it wasn't just about money. It was about being told out loud, on record, that her life didn't belong to her anymore. Here's where she begins. The clerk called my name, and my father's hand landed on my shoulder like he still had the right. "Don't make a scene," he murmured, soft enough to sound caring. I stepped away without looking at him. My heels clicked once on the tile, then stopped. Inside the courtroom, the benches behind us were fuller than they needed to be. Aunts, cousins, people who'd never once checked on me, but somehow had time for this. Judge Monroe glanced down at the file. "This is an emergency petition for conservatorship." My father stood, smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, my daughter is confused, erratic, and a danger to herself. She can't manage the trust." He dabbed under his eye with a folded tissue. The tissue stayed dry. I kept my face still and turned my gaze toward the clock on the wall. Not dramatic, just marking time. From our side. It was the quietest kind of pressure, the kind that doesn't need raised voices to fill a room. The judge's eyes shifted to me. "Ms. Crawford, do you understand why we're here today?" I drew in one slow breath. "I understand," I replied. I also understand why he invited an audience. If this kind of story hits close, you're welcome to stay with us, subscribe, and keep a seat here. My father's mouth tightened, just for a second. Then he smiled again, like nothing had cracked. The folder landed on the table with a dull sound, too light for the weight it carried. Richard's attorney stood and slid it forward. "This is a recent capacity evaluation, Your Honor." The judge flipped it open, eyes moving slowly. Careful. That was the word. Every sentence hedged. Phrases like show signs, may struggle, benefits from oversight. Nothing sharp enough to argue with. Nothing solid enough to stand on its own. Richard leaned in, hands folded. "We're not saying she's broken. Just overwhelmed." I felt my jaw tighten. Overwhelmed was what people called you when they wanted to take things away gently. The judge looked up. "Ms. Crawford, have you reviewed this report I have? And do you disagree with its conclusions?" I paused long enough to feel everyone watching my mouth. "I disagree with the purpose it's being used for." Richard exhaled, slow and patient. "See defensive." "That's what I'm talking about." Someone behind us shifted on the bench. A cough, fabric rubbing fabric. From where we're sitting. It's the kind of moment that sounds quiet but isn't. Paper can do damage without raising its voice. The judge set the folder aside. "The court takes these evaluations seriously." "I know," I replied. "That's why I read every line." Richard smiled again. The same practiced curve, but his foot tapped once under the table. Just once. When my father stood again, he didn't look at the judge. He turned slightly, just enough to face the benches behind us. "She lives in a studio," he continued, voice calm, reasonable. "No car, no property. She won't even let family see where she keeps her finances." A pause, long enough to let it sink in. "One room," my aunt murmured, not quietly. Richard nodded as if she'd proven his point. "Exactly. At her age." I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I kept my hands folded in my lap. My thumbnail pressed into my finger. Grounding. The judge glanced my way. "Ms. Crawford." I shrugged, small. "I like my place." A cousin shifted behind us. Someone whispered my name like it was a warning. Richard's voice softened. "She takes public transportation. She refuses help. She wears the same coat year after year." He smiled, almost apologetic. "This isn't independence. It's avoidance. That word landed harder than the others. I leaned forward. You leased a luxury SUV using my social security number. The room went still. Richard's head turned slowly. That's not relevant. It's about control, I replied. So yes, it is. We notice how rooms change temperature in moments like that. Not colder, sharper. The judge raised a hand. Enough. This court will consider facts, not family commentary. Richard sat back, lips pressed tight now. The patience was slipping. I stared at the wood grain on the table until it blurred, then cleared again. I could feel the eyes behind me, weighing, measuring. If I'd cried, this would have been easier for them. But I didn't. Richard's attorney stood again, this time holding a thicker stack. The edges weren't aligned. He tapped them once against the table like it mattered. There's a financial issue the court needs to see. The judge nodded. Proceed. The first page slid forward, then the second, then more. Over the past 28 months, the attorney continued, approximately $2.6 million has been transferred out of the trust. A sound moved through the benches, not a gasp, more like air leaving bodies all at once. My aunt's hand flew to her mouth. Someone behind me whispered, "That can't be right." Richard leaned back, hands open. I tried to stop it. She wouldn't listen. The judge looked at the documents, then at me. Ms. Crawford. I kept my eyes on the table, the corner where the finish had worn thin. These transfers, the attorney added, crossed state lines. No fraud alerts, no reports, nothing. Richard shook his head slowly. She didn't even notice. We've seen numbers do this before. How they turn people into judges without anyone asking them to. The judge's pen hovered. The court is being asked to freeze the remaining assets and appoint a temporary conservator. Richard's gaze landed on me at last. There it was. Relief. Certainty. I lifted my head. I noticed. The room stilled again. Not loud. Just attentive. The judge's eyes sharpened. Then you'll explain. I gathered my breath, slow and measured, and nodded once. I stood and slid my chair back in slowly. The sound felt louder than it should have, but no one moved to stop me. I don't have an explanation. I began, voice steady enough to surprise even me. I have documentation. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thin blue folder. Not thick, not dramatic, just enough. I walked it to the bench and placed it in front of the judge without rushing. Richard laughed once. Sharp. She's deflecting. The judge opened the folder anyway. Pages turned. 1, 2. Then she stopped. What am I looking at? Bank compliance records? I replied. Access logs. Device metadata. Richard leaned forward. That could be anything. I stayed where I was. Every unauthorized transfer originated from the same desktop, same browser, same network. The judge glanced up, and that location is, I exhaled, Briar Ridge Lane, Westchester County, my father's home office. Silence settled in layers, not shock, processing. Richard's attorney shifted, the pen in his hand stalling mid-tap. Richard's face drained a shade I'd never seen before. Pale, but tight, like he was holding something in. That's fabricated. Richard snapped. You can't prove that. I turned to him then. I tracked the money. I tracked the device. I tracked the pattern. We notice when confidence leaves a room without a sound. It's not dramatic. It just stops showing up. The judge closed the folder halfway. Ms. Crawford, if you knew this was happening, why didn't you stop it sooner? I rested my hands on the table, feeling the grain beneath my palms. Because stopping it early would have made it a private dispute. I needed the record to be complete. Richard stared at me like I'd spoken a language he didn't know. The judge nodded once. Continue. I sat back down, heart steady now. The room felt different. Not friendly, just No longer his. The judge leaned back slightly, fingers resting on the edge of the bench. You're saying you allowed the transfers to continue? Not allowed, I replied. Observed. Richard scoffed. That's convenient. I didn't look at him. I flagged the activity with the bank's compliance team after the first few transfers. I hired a private investigator when the second account appeared. The judge's brow creased. And you didn't file a police report? Not at that stage. I answered. There wasn't a case yet. Just suspicion. Richard's attorney cleared his throat. So, you watched over $2 million leave your trust. Over time, I said. Across multiple states. Through different entities. That's what turns suspicion into a pattern. Richard stood halfway out of his chair. She's admitting negligence. The judge raised a hand. Sit down. He did, stiff and angry, tugging once at his cuff like it was too tight. I felt my pulse in my ears, but my voice stayed even. If I'd shut it down early, it would have stayed inside this family. Quiet. Settled. I didn't want quiet. The room shifted. Not loudly. Chairs creaked. Someone inhaled too sharply. We've learned to listen for moments like that, when a room realizes it's hearing something it didn't expect to hear. The judge studied me for a long second. You understand the seriousness of what you're describing. I do. Richard laughed again, but it cracked. You planned this. I met his eyes. I prepared for it. The judge made a note, slow and deliberate. The court will take that under advisement. I sat back, hands folded, feeling the weight of it settle. Not relief, not fear, just the sense that whatever came next would be out in the open now. Richard reached into his briefcase with a suddenness that made the bailiff straighten. Paper slid free. One sheet, worn at the edges, like it had been waiting for this moment. She authorized it, Richard announced, holding it up. Years ago. She signed. She just doesn't remember. The page made its way to the bench. The judge studied it longer than I liked. This document, Richard continued, voice steadier now, gave me permission to manage the account. Her forgetting proves my point. A murmur rippled behind us. Not agreement, doubt, the dangerous kind. The judge turned the page once. Ms. Crawford, is this your signature? I stood again. My legs felt fine. That surprised me. It appears to be, I replied. I signed it during probate. I didn't read it carefully. That part is on me. Richard exhaled, sharp and satisfied. There it is. I held up my hand, palm open, but it matters what it covers. The judge looked back at me. Explain. It applied to one account. I said, 1. It expired after 12 months. It didn't authorize transfers to advisory entities. And it didn't allow personal use. Richard shook his head hard. You're twisting it. I stepped closer to the table. You twisted it the day you moved money into companies with no employees. We can feel it when a room tilts. Not because of volume, but because certainty shifts sides. The judge placed the document down. Mr. Crawford, do you have anything else? Richard's jaw worked. Once. Then again. His attorney leaned in, whispering something he didn't want to hear. I reached into my bag and set a second folder on the table. Thicker this time. He noticed. You came here asking for guardianship, I said quietly. But you're not in a position to manage anything of mine. Richard stared. What are you talking about? I met his eyes. You're about to find out. I opened the folder and slid it across the table. This one didn't rush. It didn't need to. The judge adjusted her glasses. Pages turned. Her expression didn't change much, but her posture did. Straighter. More alert. These documents, I said, keeping my voice low, show ownership of the distressed mortgage note on the commercial property on Route 119. Richard's brow creased. That's impossible. It was purchased through Northline Capital Trust. I continued. Several months ago. His attorney leaned closer to him, whispering fast now. Richard shook his head. Once, then laughed. She's bluffing. The judge looked up. The court is also seeing an assignment of debt on the primary residence. Richard's laugh stopped. I rested my hands on the table again. You stopped making payments. The note was sold. I bought it. Silence pressed down, heavier than before. Not shock, recognition. We've watched moments like this before, when power doesn't explode. It just transfers. Richard stood, then sat back down like his legs had changed their mind. You can't do this. I didn't do it today. I replied. I did it carefully. The judge closed the folder. This hearing is adjourned. The bailiff opened the side door. 2 men waited in the hallway, not in a hurry. Richard didn't look at me as he was escorted out. He stared at the floor like it might explain things. I gathered my papers, slow and steady. My hands weren't shaking. For the first time all morning, the room felt neutral. Not against me. Not for me. Just finished. The apartment was quiet when I got back. Same light in the kitchen. Same chair by the window. I set my keys down and stood there a minute longer than I needed to. My phone buzzed once. A short message from my attorney. Filed. Done. I didn't reply right away. I made tea. Let it steep too long. Sat at the small table and listened to the building settle around me. What surprised me wasn't relief. It was space. No one reaching in. No one speaking over me. For the first time in years, the silence felt like it belonged to me. I thought about how close I'd come to disappearing inside other people's words, and how choosing not to rush, not to beg, had changed everything. Elena Crawford didn't walk out with a victory. She walked out with herself intact. If this stayed with you, you're welcome to stay too. We're here when the quiet parts matter most.